Okay, brilliant. So it's great to see everybody. I'm just absolutely delighted that we're doing this. And just as we were getting ready to set up, I was saying to Megan and John that this is a kind of reunion because uh, Megan, John, and I have known each other for a long time, going back to Ashridge, and I can't remember how long. When did you join Ashridge, Megan?
Uh, 20, 20 years ago.
20 years, so that long. And John, you were already there when I joined, so
I go back
yeah,
28 years.
yeah. So, so we've known each other a while, and um, the very last thing I did at Ashridge was work with the two of you and Michael, who's also on this call, on a program um, based on your research, Megan, and Michael's work and the complexity stuff, and and it was a lovely thing to do. And I've always admired what you do and what John does, and I'm just so thrilled that you're able to come today and talk about the newest stuff. So thank you for being here. And now I'm just going to get out of the way, say nothing more other than I'm just delighted that you're both here. And John, can I ask you to do whatever you'd like to do by way of starting us off?
Thank you, Chris. When Megan and I were preparing for this, we were going to crash into how we started all our research, which is a structured pause. And we decided that actually we should start off today with more of an easy listening. So I am your soft rock DJ for the next few minutes as I set the scene and give a feel for what the shape of the next hour and a bit are going to be. In terms of the intention for the next while, we want to give you a guided exploration of what this concept of spaciousness might mean for you, so that you can put your sense alongside the one we've developed in our research. So we're not intending to try and colonize you and insist that we have the definitive answer, but what we hope to do is provide you with insights from the many conversations we've had that then might be useful provocations and stimulations for you to make your own sense. We will cover, don't worry for those of you who like some solid research findings, we will cover what we found and a bit of how we did it, because it is important, because the method was congruent. It fitted with what we were actually inquiring into. And in that whole thing that we are going to approach the next hour as much as possible in the same spirit as we did that, is we're going to do a lot of pauses. And the whole thing about giving people the opportunity to digest. And also, we won't do it quite as formally as we did on the research, but actually pay attention to what's going on in here, in the here and now of this group, this moment, as well as paying attention to what's gone on out there and is going on out there in the world for us all. And again, just to confirm, those of you who, like me, like to have things more in boxes than sort of left totally permeable, we will give you a definition. And for those who really like their consulting frameworks, we do have a 2x2. And I'm very excited because I'm allowed to present that. And for the last 30 minutes, we'll invite you into a more general, probably unrecorded conversation. So one of the things we've agreed is that this is a very personal process. So before handing over to Megan and why she needed to do this research and give you the guided pause, let me tell you a bit about where this work came from and how we went about it. So in terms of the origins, Megan and I have researched together, for those of you who don't know us, for over a decade now. We started researching into speaking truth to power and activism, both in the workplace and now in wider society. And then in early 2023, when I thought everything was, we had our portfolio of competencies and we had our research base nicely nailed down, we went for one of our walks along the canal in Berkhamsted. And Megan suddenly says to me, I want to explore spaciousness. And a large question mark evokes over my head. And I rush into, oh, what do you mean? Do you mean this? And I try and pin it down in my inimitable fashion. And then she really pulls the rug from under me by saying, and I've no idea what it is. Right. Fortunately, roll forward in the better part of 2 years, it was a really nice foreshadowing of what then we discovered, created, found during the research. And it really was about stepping into someone else's intuitive space, their felt reality. And it was this thing, we've got a very long relationship. And there is almost, well, not almost, for me, there is, if Megan says, I want to go over there, my instinctive reaction is, yeah, because something interesting is bound to happen. But that is based upon a very long relationship. And again, I think the relationship between spaciousness and relationships are all bound up together. So Megan also thought that for those of you who wanted to know there was some genuine rigor behind this, I'm just going to give you a potted sense of what the method was. I was just calculating last night. I think we've done over 100 hours of walking together, eyes open, looking at the towpath so that we didn't fall into the canal, and also pausing every so often so we could see a kingfisher flash by or something like that. And that, again, is a metaphor that is actually embedded in the research report itself. So to go along with taking seriously that when you walk together with someone, you know the world differently, you pay attention differently, we did over 50 hours of group conversations. And for those of you who know about this research, that gives you a mountain of transcripts to go through. And so we've spent many months immersed in them, coding them up, looking and trying to see what are the themes, what are the contradictions, and not trying to squeeze it into too tight a box. We've done over 40 interviews. This has been with people recommended to us. It's been with academics. It's been with coaches. It's been with business leaders. It's been with athletes. I think we've covered a broad range of people from their early 20s to I think their late 70s. I mean, it's been a fantastic range of people in all sorts of positions of life. We've done tens of workshops, mostly led by Megan. And for those who really like their quants, we've had over 1,500 responses to our quantitative survey, particularly around conversational preferences and conversational architecture, which we think, again, from when we get into the pragmatics, is a key aspect of spaciousness. And again, for those with a learning disposition, this has been really soaked in the traditions of action learning. So the whole idea is that the participation, the inquiry, has been in itself an act of learning and application, which again gives us a really nice loop when it comes to what we found and what we discovered. Cooperative inquiry has been the preferred method. I knew nothing about this 10 years ago, and now I'm as addicted as Megan is to it. We had repeated openings and closings, cycles of them. I don't know if you can remember those images. I think they're the Busby Berkeley films where you get these endless images of people coming out of a swimming pool, and it never ends. It's like a bud permanently opening. And every time you think it's finished opening, it opens again. And it was just the most extraordinary thing. Every time we thought, we've got it, suddenly something else would flower from it. So it has been an open and emergent process. Whatever the opposite of a hypothesis-led approach, this has been it. So that's been my Radio 2 soft rock DJ setting the scene feel for the day. Megan, I'm going to go to my script here. Before you invite us to pause, just in case you forgot to do that, why this work and what led to you saying this work is going to be the thing you imagine doing for the rest of your life?
Yes, I have. Yes. Thank you, John. Just lovely introduction. And can I just say how I'm noticing when everybody came on the screen and I saw all your pictures and all the names and just people from, Ashridge, people in the cooperative inquiry world, people that I've interviewed, I've worked with, I've linked in with, it was just lovely, really, really lovely to see everybody on screen. So thank you for coming. My interest in spaciousness, I suppose, has been building for years and years and years, but I'll just name 3 things that are really figural for me. One is mentioned right at the beginning of the research report, and some of you will have heard me talk about this. I was working with a big global financial institution, and we'd done an awful lot of work with inquiry groups and various other things, and a lot of people had put their heart and soul into the work. And it got to the moment where I had to do the research report for submission, you know, and it would be sent to various sponsors. And I didn't really know what to write. I felt utterly deflated, actually, not because of the work that we'd done and the quality of the work that we'd done, but because I just knew it probably wouldn't be read. And it wouldn't be read not because people didn't care, because I'd met them and they cared, but I just didn't think it would be, or if it was read, I thought it was going to be just read so top level, so superficially, because everybody was so damn busy and their attention was so easily put on the more immediate, tangible, operational than the spaces that we were opening up, which was about speaking truth to power and how do we have conversations in this place. And so, as you'll see, if you've looked at the report, and it was a delicious moment, actually, because I realized as well, because I didn't have to get this signed off by anybody, so I could do what the hell I want. So as well as feeling really deflated, I felt this enormous sense of mischievousness, which is wonderful. And I just started the report by saying, you're probably not going to read this. And I think that was a really sort of a moment where I was like, wait a second, we need to look at something really foundational here, because it's blocking some other really amazing work. So that was one thing that was a real stimulus. Another thing was a really random conversation I had probably about 5 years ago with the head of a L&D for one of the mobile telephone organizations. And on the phone, we were just having a chat, and on the phone, he said to me, he'd just come into post, and he said to me, Megan, if you were in my shoes, what would you be teaching our senior leaders? And I found myself, I was really paused, and I found myself saying for the first time, in terms of the leadership skills and development, I think a lot of them know what to do. I think a lot of them know about empathy and emotional intelligence and asking the right questions and the importance of collaboration. But I just don't think they've got any space to remember that they know it. I don't think they've got any space to put it forefront. And that was another thing that I hadn't expected to say, but found myself saying. And again, it pointed me in this direction. And the third thing I'll just mention is very personal. 2 years ago, I was employed. I was predominantly measured on my utilization, the delivery that I do. I was struggling, and still am, with 2 teenagers that have needs that are completely unpredictable. And I felt it was really hard to have the space for the work that I really wanted to do. So this is a very personal inquiry as well, and always has been. And first person action inquiry has been a really important part of what we've done. So that's a little bit of background. That's enough from me. As John mentioned, what we'd like to run this vaguely congruently with the topic of spaciousness, and also to show you a little bit about the method that we've used. So for those of you that have been in the inquiry groups, you'll recognize what I'm about to do. I'm about to just invite you to pause in a way that suits you. And I'm going to ask you to notice how you're showing up today. And this is something that we often don't notice, despite the fact that it has the most enormous impact on us and the people that are around us. So I'm about to ask you just to contemplate a few questions about what's going on in your mind, how you feel, how your body's showing up. And then I'm going to ask you also the research question that we asked everybody that we encountered here, and just give you a little bit of space and time to consider it. If this isn't asking you to notice, and using that word far too much, if this isn't asking you to notice too much, I'd also like you to spot whether you like this kind of exercise. So some of you, I can see some of you are already kind of settling in. They know what's coming. You're ready. Love this. I imagine there's some of you here that are going, oh God, she's not just about to, is she about to do a meditation? Right, okay, I'll just go and get a coffee. I'll come back when she's actually doing something. So there'll be an array of responses to this pause, and I'd love you to be curious about that as well, because that's completely central to this research and what we're exploring. Okay. So without further ado, I would love you to just make yourself comfortable in your seat. And if you'd like to, close your eyes. Otherwise, get a notebook out, look at that down in front of you. Either is absolutely fine. And I just first ask you to just take a nice few deeper, slower breaths. And we're going to check in with 3 things. Okay, so the first thing I'd love you to be interested in is what's going on in your mind? What's the state of your mind as we start this webinar? Notice if you've got quite a busy mind, whether it's quite quiet, whether you have particular questions or thoughts that are quite predominant, or whether there's lots of little things going on. Just doesn't matter what's there. So no judgment around what is there, just noticing what's going on in the mind. And then with a deeper breath into the body again. Second thing I'd ask you to notice is how you feel. So what the emotional landscape is like right now. You know, how are you? Maybe you're energetic, knackered, interested, bored, maybe feeling quite optimistic, quite sad. It might be that you're feeling a few of those things, or it might be that you've got no idea how you feel. It's far too early and you can't even cope with that. And that's fine. So again, nothing that you should or shouldn't be feeling, and no changes are necessary. Just noticing, this is how I am right now. And with a deeper breath into the body again, turning your attention to your body. So the body is something that sometimes we kind of drag around with our heads most of the day. So just doing a little bit of a scan, starting maybe with your feet on the floor and noticing the physical sensations there. And just traveling up the body, perhaps noticing areas of tension, ease, warmth and coolness, contact with the chair. Again, noticing if your mind decides to get involved and judge what you're finding. And then take another deeper breath into the body. And then the final thing I'm going to ask you just to contemplate now is the question that we started with in all of our conversations. So I'd like you to just think about bringing to mind a time when you experienced a sense of spaciousness. And there is no definition around that word spaciousness. So it is completely what comes to mind when you think about experiences of spaciousness. That might be particular moments, in which case just notice what the context was, where were you, what was going on. And also asking you just to notice what's the qualities of that experience. What do you notice are the qualities of that sense of spaciousness? And then in your own time, maybe again, lovely deeper breath into the body and opening your eyes, raising your gaze. And John and I would really love to invite you to possibly just put a few things into the chat. It might be a few words that came to mind when you considered spaciousness, a particular situation, why you think you felt spacious. So really, one word, sentences, absolutely up to you, but we're just going to pause for a second and give you a moment to put something into the chat function. John, what do you notice there?
So it immediately stood out. A couple of people were talking about, what it would mean for neurodivergent people. And again, that's one of the areas that I think we've underexplored so far. We name that we've done it, and again, it ties into the work is around attention, and the experience of attention and what is noticed is very different for people who know the world differently. So I was grabbed there, and I noticed that I went on my I almost wanted to justify why we hadn't done, rather than saying, yeah, that is to the heart of it, actually. And I also, the ones I just made some little notes. I loved, it's the less noise. And again, most of the things that I noticed just tell you more about my reaction to it rather than anything else. So the less noise, breeze. And that someone early on had written marmalade on toast. And I had such a visceral reaction. I could smell fresh toast, and I had the tang of marmalade in my mouth. I had a completely physiological response to it. Clarity, I like that as a thing. And again, I'm using words like I like because this is an emotional response to what people said. And I think spaciousness is largely an emotional quality. And the inner and the outer, someone talked about that. And I'm just looking at someone, again, people can read what's there as well. What about you, Megan?
So I noticed the first thing I noticed was the link with physical environment for many. I also picked up on some of those the senses, I suppose. So a lot of what was coming through here is engagement of the senses and sort of reveling in them. Also, I picked up some words around them, what's going on internally as well. We also picked up on that question around neurodivergence, which is a very it's a very important question for me right now, given that one of my children has ADHD. And one thing I feel like I'm in kindergarten on the subject, but one thing I have definitely noticed is a big reminder, of course, that there's a slight risk of saying, well, what's this like for neurodivergence? But of course, you then look into neurodivergence and it's just vast flavors of how we engage with the world. So it's, a little like, being careful with generalizations around if you come from certain cultures or certain countries or certain industries. It's an area that we need to explore much more of. And I have a feeling it will be, it's a vast territory because there's vast difference within that label. So that came up for me as well. And I'm going to use it, so thank you very much. I also want you to notice how you found that exercise. And particularly quite frequently in this webinar, just notice, are you loving the space? Are you getting a little bit impatient with, okay, right, we've done this now, can you just tell us what your findings were? So please do have those two lenses on what's going on, because as I said, this is very relevant to what we've been looking at. I am gonna share some stuff from findings now, because we did ask a lot of people that question, in the inquiry groups, but also in numerous workshops and various other things. I'm just going to pull out a few of the themes that came when we asked people to recall experiences of spaciousness, and actually many of them we've just seen on the screen now. So just to sort of work through a few of these, very frequently some of the first comments are around time. So there's some sort of relationship between time and space, and we'll come on to that in a second. A feeling of being at ease, which mainly means, I don't have to do something. I'm not feeling pulled to do some sort of action, make this worthwhile, be a certain way. I'm able to accept this current moment and be in it. A feeling of safety. So this links with our work on psychological safety as well. And for those of you that are interested in that field, we are really curious about how spaciousness plays into a culture that feels psychologically safe. And that quote up there was one that I've just pulled out. You know, my chief people officer has a real sense of spaciousness around her, and the way she shows up, I feel like I've got a lot of permission and protection from her in her role. As we'll talk about later, we exude a level of spaciousness or not. We impact the space that other people around us sense and feel. And safety is one of those. If we don't feel safe, generally speaking, our focus, evolution tells us, our focus narrows onto what is the problem, and our narrative mind goes into worry or fixing. Okay, so it constricts. Spaciousness is a sense where actually I don't have to, I can expand my view because I'm feeling safe and secure. There were themes around egoless attention. So something about I'm not kind of really bound up with stuff about me. I'm able to look outwards very often for other people. So there was a feeling of compassion, space for compassion. Slowing the narrative mind, that was mentioned in some of the comments as well. So just not this, we'll see the quote down at the bottom, when I have moments of feeling very unspacious, my narrative mind is on overdrive. It's exhausting. When I feel spacious, it's not ping-ponging around. I just really love that. That's a window into my mind, I think. And it's also connected with insight. So with that expansive awareness comes a different sort of perspective sometimes. And people often report a capacity for insight. And also incredibly difficult to put into words. Lovely quote up there. It's like just dissecting a bird to understand what makes it sing. And of course, this is the irony for all of our research on this. As soon as you go down and go, well, what is spaciousness? And you start putting words on it and framing it, you're sort of dissecting it and you lose the sense of what it is. And that's a wonderfully interesting challenge in terms of researching it. And the other thing is, it's not necessarily pleasant. It can be scary, overwhelming, and awkward. Just more about that now. So just 3 things. That's what spaciousness is. What it isn't, although it's often connected with time, and the first thing people think about is, I need space, I need time. Actually, in our research, it became clear that it isn't time, it's more a matter of attention. So there are occasions where people say, I had very quick meetings, but my goodness, they felt spacious. I had very long meetings. Good grief, they felt very constrained. Okay, so it's more a matter of attention and attention management, I suppose, than it is time. It isn't devoid of boundaries. I love this quote up here. I don't know how I would feel about being untethered from my spacecraft and just disappearing into endless space. I don't want to feel completely untethered from everything and everybody else. So boundaries create a sense of safety. If you suddenly at work go in and say, right, we're all having a team meeting, and I know we normally have an agenda and a finish time, but I thought today we won't, and don't know how long it'll last, not sure where it'll be. I think probably quite a few people might start feeling a little bit anxious. So some boundaries help a sense of safety and a sense of spaciousness. And then, as I was mentioning, it isn't necessarily pleasant. We come up, there was a lot of beautiful experiences that people talk about. But there is very definitely a feeling of like, well, there's a reason why I'm avoiding space in my life. There's a very real reason why I'm staying busy. Thank you very much. Kind of love this. I love this quote. Everybody just cries if you give them space. It's a thought kind of sort of nailed it, really. So it's not always pleasant. John will talk a little bit more about why we might be avoiding spaciousness. And just a final one from me, just to get slightly more theoretical about it, but I'm not going to spend a long time on this. This is in the research report. When we looked at what people were saying, one way of framing this, remember, caveat, as soon as we put a frame on it, we disappear stuff, but frames are quite interesting as well. You can think of spaciousness in terms of physical spaciousness, cognitive spaciousness, a sense of emotional spaciousness, and also spiritual spaciousness. And we have stories in all of those areas. You can also think about spaciousness in me, first person, and spaciousness in our conversation, you and me, in our intimate relationship. And then you can also think of spaciousness much more third person, all of us, societal, cultural norms. So this is, I suppose, can be quite helpful because we tend to be drawn towards a certain perspective on spaciousness. Spaciousness is about me in my head, or spaciousness is about the physical environment that we build in the world. And it can be quite helpful. In fact, it can be quite spacious to point out that there are a few ways of looking at this. And, when we get to the pragmatics of sort of how do we invite spaciousness in more, if that's what we want to do, this can be quite helpful because, of course, all of these little boxes interrelate. So they all impact on one another. The physical environment out there impacts perhaps the emotional feeling in here, which then impacts the cognitive stuff that's between us as individuals in our conversation. So I won't dwell on that, but this is a broad and wide territory around spaciousness, and our challenge is to keep it like that. And our challenge is also, very seriously, that the value in this work is probably most in asking people what spaciousness is to them, rather than us going, here's what spaciousness is. So just kind of pause for a moment and ask you to notice what you notice from this first bit, which is the territory of what is spaciousness.
And I noticed that Tom has already done that. Yeah, so it's if people can take some time now and
yes,
as we did beforehand, and I can see that Tom has already foreshadowed actually something we're going to reference. But again, it's very useful for us to know, and I hope for everybody to know what's resonating, what's landing, what sense are you making of what's being presented so far?
Yeah, so just a few moments before I'll hand over to John to, in fact, then give you our definition.
Mm.
Mm. John.
I'm just noticing I was looking at Liz's comments about the divine, maybe something to explore, but maybe too out there. I remember when you first put in this framing, when you put the word spiritual, I remember clenching up like this. And I just began to, I was very pleased when we all carry a sense of what the sacred is for us. And I like that invitation to, explore one's ontological foundations. And we're sort of, in our cultures, we're rooted in spiritual traditions. We like to all claim they're sort of just philosophical, but an awful lot of philosophy seems to be wrapped up with the spiritual. So that's spiraled into me a lot of thoughts, and I think that's possibly one of the challenging things about this, is that it can be very tempting to bracket that off. It's almost rather like not early on, in the middle of this conversation, when we're doing the research, Megan turned around to me and said, "This is a philosophical question, isn't it?" I thought, oh no, how on earth do you land a serious engagement with philosophy within an institutional, organizational world which really doesn't want to talk about philosophy? But I think that's, it's a lot of what we're really engaging with. We're smuggling it in. What about you, Megan? What's stood out for you?
I mean, just so much. I was interested in the boundaries one, and so and relating that to my own experience with mindfulness and meditation practices, and the dissolving of boundaries between. So that took me. I think then, we can get probably into a question of what are boundaries to different people. Certainly in the research, there was very often at work a connection between some boundaries and a feeling of safety. So, I kind of know who's coming, or I know that there will be a break, or I know that we're not being recorded, or these sort of some things that enabled some people to just be at ease. So that tended to be the connection with the boundaries, but I was very interested with that. Yeah.
I was sort of leap in there for a second. I know we're meant to move on, but two things. It is, I like the smuggle in spaciousness, and I wrote down the idea of being a spaciousness smuggler. I quite like that as a professional title. But I was also looking at Stuart, saying, mentioning again to the people person, director, and their capacity to create space for others. And that is, in a sense, where we want to go next with the research, which is to begin to explore relational dyads or small groups where there is the experience of being in a spacious relationship in the midst of work. And so if you, again, from a research request, it would be lovely if you come across, a couple in the work environment and you think there is qualities of spaciousness in how they are with each other. What is it about them? We would love to then begin to inquire into it, and also begin to inquire into people who are spacious with some people and not with others. And again, so the shadow of it. Megan, should we
Yes.
Right. Having said there is no definition, I will just repeat again. Everybody has their own, and this is something to put alongside your own and your emerging one, because spaciousness is so individually, socially, contextually specific. But this is, the sense that we gave us enough of a grounding around it. So spaciousness is an expansive and unhurried attention. It is something about moving away from the narrow to the broader. It is something about doing something at pace to slowing the pace. So expansive and unhurried. where we are neither grasping towards the next moment. Again, it's this within particularly global north, much of the corporate culture, that always what next, that rush to disappearing the now into the future and not running away from the previous one. And again, that disappearance of history. How do we stay in the moment? So that's one thing about present tense attention. We are also aware of our interconnection with the world around us. So while there is certainly a strong element of self and self-awareness and self-spaciousness that comes, and personal narrative, that narrative exists in the midst of life, in which our interconnected being is wrapped up with who we are. It is free from the expectations of how we need to be and what needs to happen next. I noticed when we were doing the meditation at the start, I was so wrapped up in the need to perform, I suddenly caught myself, I want people to like me. And I thought, hang on. And I was very struck by that. And it is this whole thing of how do we free ourselves from those expectations and being curious and open to potential. And this is the foreshadowing and right to the start of why I stepped into the invitation that Megan first gave to me nearly 2 years ago. I was curious about where on earth she was going with this, and we could go with this together, and open, because at that point we had no idea that we could remotely land this within the mainstream world. Initially, when we approached Megan approached one of the well-known management journals and said, this is what we're into, they replied, that's a bit woo-woo. And we're about to be published, I think, by 2 of them now. So woo-woo has moved into fashion. Okay, on to the next. So that's finding number 1, a definition. Now, then we came up with the whole notion, and we've been touching around this, and Tom, with his reference to McGilchrist in the chat, has already really sort of pointed towards this, is that we began to put buckets around the words that we saw and the phrases people use. We began to come up with a notion of a doing mode and a spacious mode. And throughout this, every time I begin to talk, or we begin to talk in a binary fashion, we're missing the point, is that these have to coexist. It is in the coexistence that something good happens. And both of these are needed. So you can also play doing mode bingo. So we could have instrumental action task, or busy tangible decision, or conditional action, closed conditional constraint. You could just take any of those 3 and you could create broadly an entire lexicon of what's taught in a lot of MBA courses. And then when we go over to the spacious mode, this very different form of being that it invites: free inquiry, expansive mutuality. And again, you can see where we know what I love in life. Comprehending systemic connectedness. You can, again, play and create your own phrases, and they invite you into very different worlds of knowing. So let's move on to something. I've already emphasized how this is about the both, not the one. So pop up the next slide, please, Megan.
Yeah, just take a deep breath, everybody, before you see this next slide. Okay, so you ready?
Okay, now you might want to both look directly at it and to one side. And I hope what most of you are discovering is that when you look directly at it, it becomes static. And when you look away from it, it suddenly looks like it's moving. And it is this notion that something is both static and dynamic at the same time, depending upon the mode of attention that you're in. I think that's enough of a metaphor for now. And we worked through a number of the metaphors. Now, I did promise you a 2x2. And again, so we thought about, well, let's think about the doing mode on one axis and the spacious mode on another. Let's just sort of populate what's in them. So if we're talking about where we're doing nothing and we're not even spacious, we're just stuck. That is a world of without dreams and without agency. So it's a purposeless. we would say the dominant mode in most, both in society and in our workplaces, is that we have low spaciousness and high doing. And this fire hydrant, there was a lovely quote, and I don't know if it's someone who's actually on the call today, where they said, you know, attending meetings in my company is like drinking from a fire hydrant. And that is this thing that we are always having too much to do. There is no space for anything. And if you do get on top of your to-do list, somebody will add an extra 3 meetings in for you, or 3 tasks. So that's busyness, which is no bad thing. Then when we have high spacious and low doing, this is where it's disconnected from the world as it is. This is where we dream. And this is the loveliness. It's a free space, but it's somehow not in the world as it is, which is then we get to the idea of where we think majority of where we're looking for people to move from is from busyness to flourishing. And this is I struggled when I first saw this image, and then I came to make my peace with it. I thought what it speaks to is the sense of having one's feet on the ground and head in the sky. There is the sense of being present and being open to possibility. So that combination of groundedness and dreaming is the ideal state. So those are our 4 frameworks. Yeah. And so if we move on to our inspirations, there are three major ones, 2 which I think you'll be very familiar with. So Tom already mentioned the work of Ian McGilchrist. And for those of you who haven't read, The Master and His Emissary is where he explores brain architecture and how that creates and enables 2 particular physiologically determined ways of being able to know the world. He also, and this is, I think, also one of our big spins in our work, was he wrote these monstrous but fascinating pieces of work called The Matter of Things. And that, again, is just an extraordinary oversight that marries philosophy, physiology, and day-to-day pragmatism. And for me, it is about parts and wholes. That's what his magic is. He is the marry of, you have to understand the importance of parts and the importance of wholes. But broadly, you have to understand parts while also always being mindful of wholes. Then on to the next one, and I'm always slightly leery of being the one who does the shorthand introduction for those who aren't familiar with the work of Martin Buber, given that Megan did her PhD informed by him. But for me, the way I make sense of his work, it is about how we know are in relationship with others and the extent to which we see ourselves in a state of independence and interdependence. There is a time for being independent of others, and there is a time for being deeply interdependent. And again, with his work, and there's a lot of the feminist relational psychology would say, we have so overplayed the independence frame of mind that actually relearning how to do interdependent connection and relationship and knowing is a huge, huge piece of work. And then the last piece of work is really from that great philosopher A.A. Milne and his work Winnie the Pooh. And we're very happy when we discovered that the 1926 edition of this had moved out of copyright, so we could actually use it. And it is all to do, and I think this really does speak to our modern condition, how hard it is to pay attention to something new when your head keeps being banged. So I'm going to finish and hand over to Megan by just reading this out. Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs now. Bump, bump, bump on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels that there really is another way. If only he could stop bumping for a moment and think of it. Megan.
And that quote came directly from one of the people in our cooperative inquiry. Might be on the call. If you are, thank you. It had a big impact on our own thinking. So just again, the last bit that I'm going to talk about is the ironically. So what do we do about spaciousness? What can we do? And it isn't actually. It's an ironic, but it's a very important question. But just to again, just pause and notice. John has talked about this doing mode, the spacious mode. it's very tricky with language. Part of what we're hoping to do with our research is to create some language for the spacious mode that could be regarded as credible in the workplace. So just pause and think, okay, what's resonated here? What doesn't feel quite so connected with how I see the world? Again, just inviting you to just pause for a moment and notice what's going on in your mind around what you're hearing so far. Some great questions coming up in the chat function, which John and I will be taking away and contemplating for a long time. Bridget, I think it was you, Bridget, that mentioned, stuckness can be a space of much potential. Yeah, agreed with that one. So again, do just note any words or any thoughts or any questions that are coming up for you. And I will just move into this last bit. So I am going to talk about, how do we encourage and how do we sabotage, which I think is a great word, spaciousness. And first of all, in the research report, there's a kind of theoretical, I suppose, more theoretical framing around this. And we look at it in two sort of ways here. We can look at the individual, we can look at the collective, we can look at internal, and we can look at external. And when you put it in this sort of framing, there are various things that we do to encourage spaciousness for ourselves individually, internally. Yeah, and there's lots of stuff we do to sabotage. So we have all sorts of cognitive dysfunctions that narrow the world, that narrow our perceptions. We overly focus, for example, on particular ways of knowing, very often propositional ways of knowing, that can sabotage spaciousness. We can learn practices like mindfulness practices that can help engage the spaciousness mode. So there's a whole kind of pile of things that sit in the internal individual zone, if you like, and we talk more about that in the report. Then there's some stuff around us as individuals interacting with the world out there. So we can encourage our own sense of spaciousness through our engagement with the natural environment, for example, through acting, going out into the world, going for a walk. We can sabotage it by constantly scrolling on our phones and engaging in certain ways in technology. We're impacted by our actions in relation to other people and the people that we surround ourselves with, that either encourage spaciousness or close it down. So it's interesting to look at areas around that. Then more collectively, we develop our perceptions. We get together in groups where we either open the way that we think about things through our inquiry, through our asking of questions. We close it down through methods of bias and groupthink, for example. So there's a whole territory of work looking at how we form our view of the world collectively together, and some of the things that we can do to expand that, and some of the things that we very often do that contract it. Lots to do with power and dysfunctions around power and how that can narrow our perspectives, or conversely, how it can open it up. And that links into the work that John and I have done over the years. And then again, collective action out in the world, the physical environment, the built environment that we have around us is a really obvious one here. Some of the systems and the processes that we set up in our organizational spaces that collectively help us to either expand or narrow our view and our interaction with the world. So there's this more sort of, I guess, theoretical look in the report. So if this is of interest, head in that direction. And then, what we did this first, and then I was thinking, okay, what about, all those people that I speak to at a conference, where I'm magically given half an hour to talk to them about spaciousness. And they are really in a frame of like, yeah, can you just tell me what to do? And there is something about bridging here to that. And with that in mind, we created unashamedly what we call the SPACE acronym. So this is, yes, this absolutely narrows stuff, but we are providing it so that it's easily remembered and so that it is actually quite pragmatic. So when we're talking about how might we encourage the spacious mode, we can think about these 5 areas, not exhaustive or exclusive. First one we've mentioned already, which is safety. So various things in psychological safety and how we create safety in our physical environment and our psychological environment that allows us the capacity to engage more expansively. So work around intelligent failures, how do you make speaking up less fearful and stressful? How do you enable that space so that it feels safe to engage with more ambiguous topics? People is around, I'm really interested in this one. Our relationships, our interactions with people through the day have an enormous impact on us and how we see the world. And you can probably think of some people that you have in your life that are just somehow amazing at lifting you up and out and kind of helping you to see the bigger picture, I suppose. You probably also know some people that kind of just get you and narrow perspectives. So who do we surround ourselves with? What social media groups do we belong to? Or do we actually need to disengage from? Which people do we get our information from? This is a really wide and really interesting topic there. And just to mention Bridget, who's on the call here as well. Bridget and Charlie, who run Spaces for Listening, that we talk about in our report, and we talk about in an article with Harvard Business Review that's about to come out.
Yeah.
And Spaces for Listening is where eight people come together who may or probably don't know one another, and there is time in a very lightly held but very important process for people to really support, listen ever so well, and speak with one another. So these processes of who we engage with are very, very critical. Attention is around some of the things that we can do with our own attention, our mindfulness practices, for example. It's to do with the metrics that we instigate in our organizational spaces that direct people's attention. It's to do with the types of conversations that we have and whether they focus a lot on task, for example, or they focus on learning and development and meaning. Conflict is a really interesting one. Here we mean the things that we can do that jolt us out of the doing mode, that are dissonant. So they might be books, or they might be conferences, or different people. They might be experts like facilitators and coaches that help shine a mirror up to us so that we can kind of see what's going on suddenly. There's sabbaticals. There's different sorts of experiences that help us to face different perspectives. And that all sits in the area of conflict. And then finally, there's environment. So where do we physically work? How do we move and shift? Where do we have our meetings? How can we change and be more creative with those that might help us into the spacious mode rather than just stay within the doing mode? So space is, we go into that in a lot more depth in the report, but space is meant to be a very pragmatic, what can we do here sort of tool that we also wanted to provide. And then the very final thing that we'll talk to is this, which is my picture of the Hoover. This comes up in the discussion in the report quite a lot. And we asked the question, and we're asking this in another article that we're writing at the moment, which is who let all the space out? So this is the fascinating interaction of space and power and attention, and the colonization of space. Why are we operating in pathologically busy organizations? You know, why is that happening? Who has agency? Who has power? Who has influence? How can we call that out? So this area of work, which we'll continue to do, connects it into the area of leadership. And it asks questions like, you know, as a leader or as a senior powerful person, I should say, how are you influencing where people pay attention in your organization? You know, what are the first questions that you ask of people? What metrics do you pay attention and do you force other people to pay attention to? What is your role in the way that you interact with others that helps them out into the spacious mode or within the doing mode? And it links as well to, I think, Laura, you mentioned, I can't remember what the word was, but under the radar spaciousness. We talk about, guerrilla spaciousness. So that, you know, it can be very countercultural to then open up space in a system that's so focused on doing. So how do you do that in a way that's more of a kind of tempered, radical, to use another phrase that John and I enjoy? I think I will, looking at the time, I think I'm going to pause there because I want to just hand back to John. There's an awful lot we've covered, and I want you to just also pause and notice what's come up in that last bit. So in the last bit, we've talked about, well, what can you do? How can we invite spaciousness? How do we sabotage spaciousness? Where's the agency here? How does power relate to this? These sorts of questions. And again, just notice what's of interest there. What inquiry questions do you have in that space? What questions do you have of us as well? And I'll also ask John just to mention anything that's coming to him.
Two things are coming to mind within that. There's somebody and got a lot of, a couple of likes around this, was having a jangly nervous system and how one's capacity to be expansive is so much an expression of one's own inner state of being. And I speak as someone who spent, oh gosh, well over 10 years in Jungian psychoanalysis in order to make my peace with my beasts. And I think that we often discount quite how much people around us are carrying within them. And we think that we can rationalize that away. And there was one last thing linking to who took all the space out and why people don't want space. And I've seen that it's one of the people who was in the research, who was in the audience today. He gave a lovely quote. He said, maybe Sisyphus, if you remember that ancient Greek mythological character condemned to pushing a rock up a hill for eternity. He said, maybe Sisyphus was a happy man. And it is this notion of actually busyness helps, and lack of space enables us not to have to think about things that otherwise are really quite disturbing.
That other lovely quote, yes, if you open up space, you let doubt in. And who wants that? That was another beautiful quote. That has so many implications for leaders and in our organizational settings as well, that we're so attached to the predictability, the kind of fantasy of control. And are we getting more and more fearful of the ambiguous, the uncontrollable, the unpredictable. I worry we lose our muscles in that. We are losing our muscles. And that's part of what this research is about. It's about saying, oh, hang on a second. Can we just take note of the consequences here? Can we create a language that means that we can not lose this capacity and not lose the muscles that we need around it?
And I'm also paying attention. I'm aware that we're now we should be wrapping up in the next 2 minutes, I think, Megan. So we'll just reflect on what we see in the chat. And I liked Bridget again talks to connection into the notion of silence. And I'm just always fascinated by the way that we discount silence, or the way we project, oh, if people are quiet, they must be compliant. Whereas, of course, silence speaks volumes, and there's all sorts of things to all sorts of people in all sorts of contexts. And silence and spaciousness would certainly be an interesting line of inquiry.
So, John and Megan, are you? Is there anything else that you want to say in the last minute or two before Philippa and I talk about the next pop-up?
No, well, I would just say thank you so much for coming. Thank you for, I hope you've noticed the ironies through the webinar as well. Okay, so John and I, right, we've got this amount of time, we've got 1.5 years of research, but wait a sec, we want to create it's got to be spacious. So there's been, I love this about this topic is that it's present all the time to be engaged with and to inquire with. So just thank you for coming and sort of playing in this space.
Yeah, thank you. And as you were talking, both of you, I was thinking about my work. As you know, one of my lockdown jobs was I got bubbled with some Benedictine monks, and to help them think about some stuff that they needed to do. And I was really struck by the difference between individual monks and their relationship with spaciousness, in that one of the busiest people I've ever seen was one of the monks who just never had a moment. He was always rushing, had a file of facts like this thick, and rushing to different highly spiritual things. And another one who talked about the difference between their formal prayer life, keeping the offices of the hours 6 times a day. He said, but that's not my real prayer. He said, my real prayer is all the stuff in between, like when I'm washing up. He said, so I do the work and keep the hours, and I wash up and I make fudge. And the way I make fudge is my prayer. And the difference between 2 ways of living an entirely, cloistered spiritual life, and the different relations to spaciousness in that was quite, striking. I learned lots of things from monks. We could run a whole new thing about that. Meanwhile, can I just say to both of you, thank you. I will, as ever, just write my own reflections on what it's been like being here and put it in a blog along with when we send out the recording. And the next pop-up we've got is in some ways very different. It's Gary Cookson coming to talk about his new book on hybrid working. And in another way is not at all different, because I noticed in the chat, I think it was either Colin Williams or William Collins, I'm not sure, on the call, was talking about, well, going back to the office and what's the relationship between that and everything we're talking about here. So I would invite anybody who is interested in exploring that to perhaps, either put a question to us that we can put to Gary for the next webinar, or just come along and see what happens. And we will put out an invitation. Richard, can you tell us when it is?
It is on the 19th of February at, I think, 8:30 till 10 a.m. And I've just
Very
popped the link
spacious.
in the chat.
Very
That would be
spacious.
very
And it's going to be till
spacious.
10 p.m.
Philippa, anything you would like to say?
I was actually noticing the richness of the contributions that people have been making in the chat, and I think that is going to be really worthy of us all having a look at. And when the recording comes out, I believe, Rick, you can tell me otherwise, but I believe the chat comes out with it, because the chat is saved as part of the recording, so that those are really rich. So I've noticed it was a very busy chat, but there were very diverse, and you know, some ranging from really practical questions, others much more esoteric comments and observations, and sort of everything in between. So I thought it was a really rich chat in the chat. So thank you everybody to your contributions for that, and of course particular thanks to John and Megan for your research, for your multiple hours of walking and then talking with lots of other people, and it's been a joy. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation.
Welcome. Thank you everybody for coming.
We look
Have a
forward to
good
seeing you
day.
another time. Bye bye.
Bye bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.